Good morning,
Yeah,
everybody.
well, officially
My name
part
is
of
Weston
it.
Bledock.
Thank
I'm
you
the
very
president of the Woodstock Historical Society. Welcome to the Pathway Through History, I Love New York panel discussion of family tales of farming and country life around old Woodstock. Today we will hear about farms and farming from the descendants of Woodstock's farming families. Some of the panelists still own and run their own family spreads and are profiled on the wall behind me. Back in the day, Woodstock had a wild beauty that attracted legions of artists to replicate its charm in their landscapes over here. When the artists arrived, farmers found it more economically rewarding to house artists in their chicken coops than to raise chickens. But all was not well between the artists and the farmers. The artists, after a day in the fields painting landscapes, would often leave rags saturated with oil paint behind. The cows would eat them and get sick. I am sure we may hear some stories from that era and others about the early farmers' interactions with bears and rattlesnakes that are bound to amaze us. I, for one, am eager to learn more. Panelists, please raise your hand as I introduce you so the audience knows who you are. Debbie Heppner, Sue, Danny. All right. Our esteemed moderator is Michael Drillinger, a fellow board member who recently completed the tool shed display that you can visit on the way out. Won't you please help me welcome Michael and the panelists.
Welcome. Oral histories are valuable records of the past. As long as there have been generations, there have been stories to pass down to the next generation. They keep the memories of ancestors alive and teach us lessons. Here in Woodstock, there are families that go back almost to the beginning of European settlement of this area and the Catskills. You know, before as Weston pointed out, before the hippies and the musicians, before the artists, there were farm families. There were merchants and tradespeople who scratched out a good living. Family stories keep alive how these folks not only lived but not only survived, but how they thrived. They worked together, they played together, they worshiped together, and they supported each other through adversity. Today we're going to share some of these stories, and I hope everyone finds them as enlightening and enjoyable as I have. In addition to my esteemed panelists, I've spoken with at least half a dozen or more representatives of other families who told me their stories, and I hope to share, although they couldn't be here, I hope to share some of what they shared with me. Before we start, I would like to try a little exercise. If you here were born or raised in the Woodstock or greater Woodstock area, raise your hand.
Including us.
Yeah.
Raise your
Thanks.
hand in.
If you have or had a parent that was born and or raised in the Woodstock area, raise your hand. Thanks. If you had a grandparent, similarly raise your hand. Great. And if you had a great-grandparent,
4 of them.
So I want to encourage those of you in the audience who similarly have stories that will contribute to what the panelists have to say to please enrich the discussion with any memories that you have or stories that came down to you. So to start, I would like to ask Debbie and Sue and Dan to just very briefly say something about your family backgrounds and how far back you trace. Dan's already said great-grandparents, four generations.
Well,
And
that's where you stopped.
yeah, I saw the family tree. She's right. Anyway,
Okay, my connection to Woodstock is through my father. My mother was an outsider. She came from Highland, really far away. In my father's family, his mother was a Reynolds, so probably somewhere Sue and
I'm married into the Reynolds.
she married into it. We crossed, and my husband's family is actually connects with the Ostrander,
Ostrander.
so we have a lot of connection here. And the Reynolds, I think, have probably been around here for many, many years. My father's great-grandfather was born in Shady and sort of around sort of that hollow area, I think, where the McDaniels farm is, and probably had some early roots in farming the land, although his claim to fame was my great-grandfather was that he became a manager at the Overlook Mountain House and eventually built the Reynolds boarding house. So he got out of the farm business as soon as he could and became a sort of in the tourist trade pretty quickly. My grandfather's, my father's father actually came here, his family came here in about 1908, and it suddenly dawned on me that the Allens had been here for over 100 years, so I guess they're not so new. I always thought they were the new part of our family. And he was an artist and an inventor who lived in Ohio and friends with Burge Harrison and Alan Cochrane. So he came here to paint. So when the children of these two men got together, I always felt it was sort of a merging of the old and the new, and the result was several more generations of our family. And my son still lives here, so it's hopeful that we might get a few more Alan Heppner family members here. So that's where I came from.
Well, my father's family, both my grandparents on my father's side, had deep roots here in Woodstock. McDaniel was my great-grandmother on my grandmother Ostrander side. My mother's side were also farmers, but not from here. They were from Fort Ticonderoga area and Hague, New York, up in that way. They ended up down here because my grandfather was a minister, and that's how my mother met my father, much to my grandparents' disdain because they didn't want her dating a farmer who took her
Minister
on
in a farmer store.
took her on dates in a cattle truck. But anyway, so through my father's side mainly is where our roots are in Woodstock, and always had their hand in some sort of farming, more to sustain the family than to make a living on, for our story anyway. The Ostranders themselves settled in the Hudson Valley in Esopus and Kingston area in 1661. They came to America. 1661. On my shoe.
We're gonna have a little sibling discussion here.
This is my brother. We argue often. But
I'm
so,
older, I know better.
So they were farmers down in the rich valley land, and then I'm not exactly sure when they came to the town of Woodstock. I think it was early 1800s to mid 1800s that they branched out here to Woodstock, town of Woodstock. Your turn.
Well, she's pretty much covered. The only thing that I can contribute to that is the other side of our family was also a Woodstock, West Shirley area family, and it was the Russells.
Which the McDaniel married
Right.
Russell, right?
My great-grandmother McDaniel married a Russell, Orrin Russell, and it's funny that we tie into this mountain house
Yes.
because that's how they got together. My great-grandfather Orrin Russell, back in the day when they were talking about tourism, people would come up from the city for 2 weeks, a month, or whatever to stay at the Overlook Mountain House, which is the monastery now. My great-grandfather drove the stagecoach.
You mean Meads Mountain?
that picked up the people at the train station in West Charlie and delivered them up there. My great grandmother worked in the kitchen, was a chambermaid, did whatever, and that's how they met. So that is another tie-in of families, you know. It's not, you didn't jump in the car and go to Long Island to find a woman.
Which is something that I discovered. I mean, I knew, but it was really cemented home in my discussions with these folks and others, how everybody married everybody up here. There are only a handful of family names, and everybody's related to everybody somewhere along the line. I myself am a very newcomer. I have two grandparents who were born here in this country, and two grandparents who came from the old country, and I'm very new up here, but I have been very touched and warmed, and I'm very appreciative of how accepted I have been. They let me play here in the Historical Society and do stuff, and they'll actually talk to me, and I appreciate that. Living up here in the country, I'm sure everyone here has had some interaction with wildlife. Deer roam all over the place. A little aside, by 1875, every white-tailed deer had been hunted to extinction in the Catskills. There were none. And then over the next 25 to 30 years, New York State tried to repopulate the Catskills and failed miserably. But the deer themselves wandered back down from the Adirondacks, over the Delaware from Pennsylvania, and now, since the only natural predator of the deer is the hunter or the automobile, there are way more deer than we know of, than have ever been in this area historically. And folks will probably talk about the trees as well, how forested our area is now, which wasn't the case when Europeans started settling this area. But I want to read something that was transcribed from an interview with Romain Wilbur. He says, I remember taking the bear to Lake Hill store for ice cream. The interviewer says, wait a minute, what bear? And Romain continues, we got it when it was a little fella. And boy, I love to be with you. It would eat anything around the house. We would take the bear with us to the Lake Hill store 2 miles away and get ice cream. How did you get the bear in the first place? Asked the interviewer. Herb Keith's dog had it up a tree. It was held up a tree, and we got it out of that tree and we took it home. And we had the bear 2 or 3 years. And he'd out-chase the kids to school, that bear would, The bear would come right with him, He'd want to go to school and learn something. Oh yeah, that was a good friend, that bear.
Could have taught Romain.
But Danny, you've got a story about a bear, or a few bear.
Multiple bear, yeah.
That
My great grandfather and
Oscar.
more friends than one, but one particular friend was Oscar Howland, and he grew up in the Shady area, and he had one arm, and I don't know whether famous is the right word, but a lot of people have heard about this famous one-armed bear hunter. Him and my great-grandfather would bear hunt. They would not always live trap, but they would live trap bear. Somewheres in my family, we can't locate it now, but there's a picture of my great-grandfather's house in Silver Hollow in Willow with an apple tree out front and three, it's gonna sound disgraceful or whatever, but there were 3 bear chained up to an apple tree in front of the house. But they were treated like livestock. They were fed, they were watered. The bear had many uses. It wasn't only food. Everything back then was horses and harnesses and everything else. And the bear fat would be rendered to treat the leather so that it didn't crack, so it was supple, so it was waterproof. They waterproofed their boots and their clothes with the lard from the bear. And it was just
Something they did.
yeah, you needed a bear or you needed to eat or whatever, and your pork wasn't ready, they disposed of the bear and used everything of it, from the fat to the skin to the meat, and that was part of their livelihood. And my great-grandfather was also, they were talking about it was a self-sustaining farm. I mean, he raised his children, they had their pigs, they had their bear hunting, their cattle, their beef cattle, their dairy
timber.
cattle, the timber, what they couldn't barter with their neighbors for or make themselves, they would go on the mountain, cut some oak. There was a barrel factory in Kingston. They would cut oak, load it in the wagon, drive it to Kingston in the wagon, sell the lumber, the timber to the barrel factory, get the money from that, buy the supplies they couldn't do for themselves. It was almost like the Old West. They would get their flour, their sugar, their cloth, whatever they needed. And at the time, I think I remember it was like a 3-day trip. It was like they would leave Willow, go down there, do whatever they had to do, spend the day there getting their supplies, and then another day back. So that's...
What year would that have been?
Pardon?
What year would that have been?
My great-grandfather was born in 1872. So I would say this would be
Pa was 1903.
1903, right?
That
So
was my grandfather's birth date.
and
Pa remembered-
Elliot was
Pa remembered
86.
doing that.
Yeah,
So early
86.
1900s was, my grandfather was telling us about.
Did they stay in a hotel?
I don't know, he didn't say.
I would
He
assume.
may-
I would
He may
assume.
not have wanted to reveal where they stayed. I don't know.
Well, I'm sure my great grandmother went along too, because she had to pick out the fabric. So I don't think it was just a male trip. There might have been a saloon or two involved, because my great grandfather did like his cider. But so that was part of the heritage, and then that was a fairly large family, which a lot of families were then. The boys, as soon as they were old enough, they started helping in the fields and in whatever they had to do, and the girls helped out with the chores and taking care of the younger kids, and it was
Great, thank you.
to me it would have been it was a great way to grow up, I guess. You
Yeah,
know.
Yeah.
Yep.
Debbie, do you have any animal stories to share that may have come down?
Come down. Well, for me, not really animals. I grew up underneath Ohio Mountain, and I grew up listening about the rattlesnakes on the mountains. And when my great-grandfather was a manager at the Overlook Mountain House, his wife, Elizabeth, also worked in the kitchen. She also had 7 children. He was more of the sort of the manager party guy, and she really did the hard work. But she had a special frying pan. I would hear this story all the time about how she had a special black frying pan which she would cook rattlesnakes, because the guests considered that a great delicacy. So she would cook that for the guests. But all that I really heard was the fact that there were rattlesnakes on the mountain, and I lived at the base of that mountain and spent my entire childhood petrified that they were, coming to get me. So my brother talks about running over the mountain, taking the trails up, going with his friends, nothing. I mean, it took me, I think I must have been a teenager before I actually walked that trail up to the top of Overlook. But we also, I have to say, growing up on Glasgow Turnpike, we hardly ever saw deer until if it was a very dry season, and it was and they'd come down for water. I never saw a bear in my life, you know, living almost in town. Or fox, or, you know, rabbits, squirrels, chipmunks. That was sort of the extent of the town wildlife. I live in town today, and I have everything in my backyard, including the bear. But the rattlesnakes on the mountain, I mean, were, to me, like just the scariest part. I forgot the beautiful lore of the blueberries and the view. It was all about the snakes.
Yeah, great story. Does anybody have a local animal story that may have come down through the family?
Well,
Janine.
Walter Maurer and Noah Maurer used to take a wagon loaded with fruits and vegetables over to Elm Park, and they had this one story that they would tell about as they were coming back. There was a panther that followed their horse and wagon through the notch.
Yeah.
And they had a very, maybe you guys haven't heard it.
Well, I was going to bring
The
that up.
Mayflower Notch?
My father always called them catamounts, and there were plenty of cougars or catamounts or mountain lions, whatever you want to call them.
That was their one story about the encounter on the way back. You know, the horse stayed its path. They just kept going, and you know, the cat followed them along, and then off it went. And that's enough to make you nervous about taking a herd.
My grandparents, my grandfather, growing up in the end of Silver Hollow, they actually walked through the notch to Hunter for school. And they never were to walk alone. And he had told stories. I believe he said the scariest he'd ever been was when he was walking home from school.
And had the sense of somebody
Had the sense, and he could hear. Now, whether, you know, when you're worried and you think you hear something, you might think it's more, but it let out a scream. And then he had no doubt. And he said that scream sent chills right down. And he said that was the most scared he'd ever been in his life was when he heard that.
Oh my! You know, in our little book there that Jean White wrote about the tales Sarah talked about growing up as the caretakers at the Mountain House, we have an illustration that Jean did of the wagons going, which is hard to believe, but they took supplies and, you know, wagons went up to the Mountain House and of the big containers of milk and the bear, it's a wonderful picture. The bear, you know, coming up behind the wagon and tipping the milk over just for
great.
a little snack.
Yeah. And I'm glad you bring up milk. Farming has been the foundation on which Woodstock was built. And most of the farms, as Sue mentioned, were supporting the farm family more so than for sale, as you know, as a business. So the farmers, the farm families kept vegetable gardens to feed the family. And they also kept livestock in addition to bear. Cows, sheep, pigs, horses did a lot of the work, oxen did a lot of the work. But they did, and they bartered, as Dan mentioned, for things that they didn't have. So, you know, if you needed lumber, and you might barter a cow for lumber you needed or something like that. But they would also sell milk and eggs, and this would give them the hard cash that they would need to be able to go into town like Woodstock or beyond to Kingston to pick up supplies. Dairy farming was big business. Well, dairy, when I say big business, what I mean is many of the farms up here were dairy farms. It's the soil of the area, especially up in the hills, just didn't lend itself for large-scale crop production. But this is a story told to me by Brad Leonard, who he told me that the roots of his family, also in the mid-1800s, Dr. Rufus van de Bogard married Elvira Cooper of Cooper Lake fame, and Rufus and Elvira had a number of children. Among them was Aaron and Luther. Aaron started farming up Hamadi Lane off of what's 212 now, and Luther went over towards Wittenberg Road and was farming there. At some point they switched farms. So Luther got the Hamadi Lane farm and Aaron ended up farming off Wittenberg Road. He married, he had a wife, Minnie, and the two of them had a daughter, Beatrice, and then Minnie died. And Aaron remarried Mabel Crane. Mabel's children included Charlotte, David, and Aaron Jr. Beatrice married George Leonard Sr. They had a son named George, and George Jr. fathered a son named George. George III, whose middle name was Brad, and hence Brad Leonard goes by the name Brad rather than George III. At some point, so the Van de Bogarts, or the Aarons, raised dairy cows. And among Aaron Jr.'s chores were bringing the milk cans down to a cold spring on Wittenberg Road and leaving them in the spring to keep them cold. And Roland Schultes would collect, who had a large dairy farm on Coldbrook Road, would collect the milk cans and eventually bring them down to the Babcock Dairy in Kingston. So, what is your relationship to dairy cows?
My grandfather ran a dairy. My grandfather started out, like I say, in Silver Hollow, and then as he became older and they didn't need him as much around the farm to do the work at the farm, he was like sublet to work for other people, other farms. So my grandfather was working as an older teenager on the farm on Ostrander Road that he ended up owning, where our property is now. But he ended up working for a family, two brothers, the Mosher brothers. And they were basically chicken farmers at the time. And my grandfather, he said, I'll go ahead a little bit. He left there and worked for Standard Oil, driving a chain drive Mack, delivering fuel for Standard Oil. He went to work for DeForest Packing Company, which was a big packing company down on the Strand in Kingston. And from there, he built up his own packing company, his own slaughterhouse, which was located on Jones Quarry Road, off of Maverick Road. During World War II, everything was stamps you had to have, and he was so concerned that the next knock on his door was going to be OPA, which was the government, to come down to shut him down for selling or illegal, whatever. So back when he was working at the farm that we own, the property we own now, it was 100 degrees and he was mowing hay by hand. And he said to himself, he told me this story, whether it's true or not, I don't know. But he said, he was mowing hay by hand. He said, if I'm going to work like this, I'm going to own this place someday. So with the pressure of World War II, he sold the slaughterhouse on Maverick Road and bought the farm. So that's when he started running a dairy, and he ran a dairy, and they would,
Isn't that from the can, the milk can?
The milk can over there is from my grandfather's dairy, yes.
and they would do, and my father grew up the same thing, that they had a cool room, which they called the milk house, and then everything went in milk cans. There was no bulk pickup or anything at that time. And then one of my father's first jobs was to load the milk cans in the pickup truck and take it to the Babcock, to the dairy in Kingston and sell that. And then my grandfather branched into logging from there. But
We'll get to that.
dairy was a big thing here.
It was done being a dairy by the time I came around.
Oh, yeah.
So I got the fun part of farm life. I didn't get the 4 o'clock every morning till 8 o'clock at night every morning like my father experienced, but.
I wonder when the roads were built though that allowed the distribution of it, for the farms that did.
Well, the roads were just lanes heading to the end of the farm. I mean, Ostrander Road actually in my childhood was not paved yet. You know, I think in the
Maintained by the people
mid-70s
that
it was
lived there,
paved maybe.
basically.
To distribute like the quantity, that must have been, you have to wait for railroads to come in now.
Well, they would take the cans down. I mean,
Well,
go ahead.
my great grandfather in Silver Hollow, this is before vehicles and everything, and this is Silver Hollow in Willow, which is a whole different country as far as weather and everything. But so everything in the winter was sleighs. Everything in the summertime was wagons. So if you wanted to transport anything in the winter, it was sleighs. And if the snow got too deep, they had a plow that they drug behind the horses to make it so that the sleighs went better. So they were plowing their own road with horses.
Janine has a
Just wanted
question.
to, was there an opportunity for your family to take their milk to Coldbrook train station and have it go to Kingston on train?
It was never mentioned in my,
Yeah, because it
experience.
was nicknamed the milk train.
Yep.
Where that was
Right.
going, I'm not,
Anything I ever heard of was by
By
truck or wagon.
so that's later maybe.
although there are many stories, because most of the Wittenberg farmers went that way.
Right.
Because they had to go down, all they had to do was go downhill. They'd bring the empty stuff back, that was no problem, but look, they only had to go downhill.
And you said this was,
I actually do have a dairy story.
Yes.
you said that was from World War II on, and then by then the trains were beginning to, railroads were
Right,
beginning.
Right.
So
True.
that'd be early.
When he had the dairy, yeah, it was later.
I just wanted to say that growing up in the 50s, I never thought of this as a farming, gardens weren't even, they were sort of common, other than the Longyear farm, which is what, every kindergarten class got to go to the Longyear farm. But one of my best friends was Heidi Bumgarten. And so her family lived on the Bumgarten farm, if you're going down towards Saugerties. And in my childhood, Grandma Bumgarten had 6 milk cows. And, and she really ran that as a very, providing milk to Kingston dairies. So that as a child, we would play there, in the barn with the cows. It was like our brief farm experience, but watching Grandma Bumgarten milk the cows. She promised me that when I got old enough, she'd teach me how, but unfortunately, it took me too long to get old enough, and she eventually stopped having cows. But the interesting thing is that we drank raw milk there, which
Yeah.
was,
Yeah.
if you've never really experienced raw milk, it's a whole nother ball game.
Yeah.
And there were 3 of us, Andrea Neer and Heidi Bumgarten and myself. Andrea and I would pray that the milk was from the day before and that it had been in the refrigerator. Because if it was at all warm, oh my God, you had to develop the taste. But Grandma Bumgarten promised us, long lives if we drank her milk. So I'm hoping that that's really true. But it was, for someone who didn't see herself as I grew up in a ranch house on Glasgow Turnpike, but to have that opportunity to play on that, in that property with the dogs and the cows, and I think they had some chickens there. And it was a great little place, and we've sort of forgotten that that was originally, that barn is sort of long gone, that was there. Now it looks pretty elegant stone house, but.
And by the time I was old enough, my grandfather had stopped his dairy business. And when he ran his dairy, I don't know exactly how many cows. It wasn't nowhere near what today's dairy are,
No.
but he milked,
They
I think he milked around 40 cows at the best he was doing. He kept, there would be like 60 head of dairy cattle, and he would be milking 40. But he had milking machines. So,
Which was new.
which was really, at the time, innovative. So by the time I grew up, he still had his dairy. Once it's in you, I guess it's in you. He still had to have his dairy cows. So we all learned to milk a cow.
I should have come to your farm.
Yeah, that was part
Goats are much easier to milk.
But anyway, so the dairy production dairy was done when I was of old enough. I didn't see any of that. I just saw the results. You know, the stanchions were all in the barn and all of that.
And he still raised
Yeah,
cattle after the dairy.
He
was
then
raising
he went
beef
big into
cows
beef cows then.
and raising pork and chickens and,
At one time he had about 60 head of Hereford cows.
yeah.
Anybody else want to?
I have a question. I've always heard, I taught local history in Ontario, and I've always heard that one of the products of the Catskills that made it to New York City was butter. Do you know anything about Catskills butter, or was that not particularly Woodstock?
I don't know, I
The
know that
the
they
only
did
butter
sell
that I did-
butter. They had
That I
that big,
did personally with my grandmother. We had an old churn and we would do it.
Right.
But basically, I think
they had
the
a cradle,
Catskill butter
cradle churn.
probably came out of the Babcock's dairy. We
Right.
sent the raw product there and then they turned it into the finished product.
Right, so you weren't sending them butter, you were sending
No,
them.
we were sending them milk.
Yeah.
And when I was doing the research for this exhibit, a lot of the farmers provide, what they did sell, they sold to the local boarding houses and to the mountain houses. And butter was a big commodity that they wouldn't have to make it in huge amounts, but they would sell their butter, their eggs, provide milk to Overlook Meads,
Right.
McDaniels.
Great.
I just have a question about the milk cans, just the mechanics of how they got them into like the cold water, but also getting them out, because they're so, I can imagine how heavy they must be when they're.
Men were men back
That's where
then. Men were men and boys were boys.
boys were, yeah.
So I think maybe a hoist or something.
No,
That's amazing. Kind of silly question.
no,
No,
it's
it's
true,
good. It's a
they
good
would lift,
question.
they would lift.
And Sue
And load 'em.
explained that there's a number on that milk can and that
Every dairy had a
every dairy
number.
had their own number.
So they knew where the milk cans,
So there's-
Who got the money?
This thing about keeping the milk cold. There was no refrigeration until late 1940s, early 1950s, and I know I grew up. My grandparents still called the refrigerator the ice box. And an ice box was literally a box with a block of ice on the top. So the ice had to come from somewhere, and ice harvesting was obviously a winter activity. And here's a story from Roy Van Wagener. He says, "Now ice. We had ice because there was no refrigeration. When I was little, I can remember cutting ice down the road here. There are remnants of the pond. I didn't do any sawing, but I expect first you had to get a hole in the ice. Then they used a long saw which only had a handle on one end, which you could use with two hands, and you pulled up and down to saw. It had real big teeth and sharp. So you cut the ice in big chunks, and cross-cut it, and then split it off with a bar. And then you had a pipe pole that the firemen even used still. And you pulled the chunks of ice out and loaded it one way or another onto your wagon and into the ice house, where it was packed in sawdust. Pretty good insulation. Of course, that cooled the milk you had and anything else. Now, we talked about William and Elizabeth Reynolds, and among their children were Victor and Clarkson.
Correct?
And
Yeah. And William bought property to set up his two sons in an ice business, which was located, now I can't remember, off of going to Bearsville. I can't think of the name of that road. Lasher Road. And that was, where they had a pond in the barn, and they actually built that original, the house was built there, and they had an ice business and would provide, actually, we sort of think of it as Clarkson's business, and Victor was along for the ride. But they provided, ice for the area, and I don't know, Richard found a story about how they ended up, Clarkson, I don't know whether one of the local artists wrote a song about Clarkson, the Iceman.
The W.C. Fields character, where he plays an Iceman, is based on Clarkson.
Oh, really?
There was a
That's
summer
cool.
play at the Playhouse, and one of the stars loved Clarkson. She wrote a song about him that eventually made its way to Zoe Flo Ziegfeld, who knew W.C. Fields. It was, the Iceman is such a nice man. He will please you, then he'll freeze you. It wasn't a big hit, but...
Yeah.
That's funny.
You see W.C. Fields in the movies where he's carrying a block of ice into the ice box.
Yeah.
That's based on Clarkson Lakes.
Yeah.
Not to change the subject on you, but along with no refrigeration, that's why there was a lot of salting.
yes,
Right.
The
Curing,
brines.
smoking.
Pa always had a crock full of salt pork and stuff going. He had a ground cellar, and you could go down there and smell all kinds of wonderful smells that I can still smell to this day.
And
And some
canning.
not so good.
And
But
canning,
canning.
everybody, anything you can,
And-
you can.
And in the house, the farmhouse that my grandfather was born and grew up in on Silver Hollow, that house, like many houses, were built over a spring. And they used that cold spring in the cellar as refrigeration. So, and they also fished out of there
yeah.
from time to time.
And just,
And that's what I was gonna ask, 'cause my father grew up in farm in Missouri, and the stories are all pretty much the same so far,
Yep.
except for the bear. I don't recall a bear, there were wolves in the stories, not
Yeah.
bears. But anyway, but what I was gonna say is in the 30s, when there was, my grandfather was also a lawyer, but I guess there was a downturn in that too, and they started, basically selling entry to their ice ponds for fishing. They had 5 ponds, and I still have some of the little tickets to the ice ponds, so I just wondered about the fishing. So the ice ponds were also used for fishing?
Yeah, what I was talking about was just there's a pond, there's a creek on the property and a spring, Fred,
Right.
and sometimes the fish would be coming up and
The-
they could
the
actually
the basement
fish in the
was laid up
cellar.
with- The
The-
basement was laid up with fieldstone, it wasn't a poured foundation, so there
Right.
were nooks and cracks in it. And in the spring, there would be small brook trout in the basement, so they could go in the basement.
They could actually go down and
catch
fish.
breakfast.
Do you think that was a typical thing in many houses?
I believe early on, a lot of times, especially where the winters were so harsh and stuff, the houses were built either right next to or over a spring.
Yeah, because I think the Lasher Funeral Home had it set, he was in one of the side buildings, it was over water, and then 2 years ago,
Yeah, the parlor has water that runs under it.
It was definitely, I lived in a historic house outside of Boston at one point, and there was a stream that ran through the basement, that was just how it was.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a little
I think it-
unnerving to a city person person,
Right.
stubborn person like myself.
But it was
or never
practicality
recognized.
for these times, you know, where you lived, you used whatever resources you could to make anything easier for yourself, so.
Well, I think the McDaniel, their business there was called Cold Springs for a while, the farmhouse on top, and I think there was a very icy cold mountain
Yeah.
spring that came right down past the house, which also supposedly had health value, I would guess. That's what they told their visitors anyway. But I'm sure it had a lot of other.
Well, the
just having-
water's obviously good.
Yeah, really
It's
cold,
still
good. And I'm not sure if it's still,
great
if that's
water.
still as present anymore, that really, but it was called the Cold Spring. It wasn't that the name of, I think that was one of the names that their mountain house had for a while.
Yeah, and I know that place names are not acquired at random. I mean, there are reasons why roads have certain names and places have certain names, and you remind me of Coldbrook Road.
Yes.
Why is it Coldbrook Road? So, and part and parcel of ice harvesting, there was other harvesting that was done, timber harvesting and bluestone quarrying, you know.
The tanning.
And the tanning. Along with the Tannery Brook is called Tannery Brook because there was a tannery there. And one of the other things that folks did up here when tanning was a big industry, which is basically the early to middle 1800s. The Catskills provided all the leather for the Union Army. And one of the main ingredients was hemlock bark. Of course, hemlock bark was used in the tanning process, so collecting the hemlock bark, being a tan barker, was...
That's right. The mountains are full of what were called old bark roads. And they were small. They weren't like log roads as we know them now. And a lot of them were like tunnels or funnels because it was just to get the bark down off the mountain to wherever they needed it or whatever. They were called bark roads.
And Sue, you have a story about a certain piece of bluestone. There were lots of large bluestone quarries around the Catskills. It was a major industry. Bluestone was used to pave the streets of New York City and Philadelphia and Boston and as far away as Havana, Cuba. But in Woodstock and the surrounding hills, other than California Quarry and Overlook, farmers would often have areas on their farm where there was an outcrop of bluestone that could be quarried on a small scale and bring additional income to the family. And I do know that your family did that.
I don't know if our family ever did it for profit or if it was done before the property became our family's.
Right.
But there's a
There's
series,
testatorys.
from our property west towards Silver Hollow, there was a quarry that they actually worked. And to our east in Mink Hollow, there was a quarry that they actually worked. On our property, there's a series of what I call test quarries. And it looks like they went in there exploring to see if the stone was going to be suitable for what their needs were and how easily it was going to be accessible. And apparently it didn't work out because there were never a working quarry. So there's exploration there and tailings and stuff, but it wasn't like a major industry for our family anyway.
But didn't you also do, didn't your father and grandfather and great-grandfather and before that do timber harvesting?
Oh, the timber
I mean,
harvesting,
you know,
definitely.
Wood was needed for construction and also fuel.
And they sold,
And
they
money.
did
And
timber
money.
lots.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
They logged big time when I was a child.
for money.
They still do it for money.
The root of all evil.
Well, also for survival. But your dad did surprise, when Sue and Dan talk about Pa, that's their grandfather. And then
Right.
their great-grandfather was,
Old
Old
Pa.
Pa.
Actually, now that you mention, I just have to, my great-grandfather was born in 1872, and he died in 1968. He went through quite a few transitions in this area and in life to begin with. And I had the fortune to spend a lot of time sitting on his lap in an old wicker rocker chair or sitting next to him in his bedroom, because in his later years he lived with my grandparents, which were just up the road. So every minute I had after school I was with. So there were a lot of old stories, and he wouldn't even know what a shower was unless he stood under a waterfall. He didn't know what a bathtub was. Everything was sponge baths. And it trickled down. The youngest, they would have a big tub and they would heat water on the wood stove or whatever, and they would bathe the youngest first to the oldest. And they would change the water now and then, I guess,
I would hope. Sorry, Debbie.
as needed, but
It was a large family. I would hope they changed the water.
Dan, you had mentioned as an aside, relatives enjoying cider.
In spike size?
Well,
No,
cider.
Hard
Cider.
cider.
the
Hard
other's
cider.
apple juice.
among the folks I got the opportunity to talk to was Tom Chase. And Tom relayed a story that his dad, Chip, had told him. And Chip told Tom a story where his dad, Chip's dad, Tom's granddad, Stuart, made hard cider and kept it in a barrel behind the barn. One winter, Chip and his buddy, Ashley Wilbur, used a hand drill to make a hole in the barrel and draw off some of the cider. They plugged the hole so the rest of the cider remained. Cider is made when pressed apple juice is allowed to ferment and turn into alcohol. The part the boys tapped into was the hard cider, the alcohol portion. They kept drawing from the barrel all winter and sharing the hard cider with their friends. In the spring, when Stuart went to get what he thought was hard cider, he basically found apple juice. The boys were found out, and they got into some big trouble.
He's been there.
Yeah, well, we'll get there in a minute. Tom shared a more recent story that the reason the barrel was left out all winter is that cider has to be kept cold, otherwise the fermenting liquid can burst the container. Another cider story Tom tells is when he brought a jug of his own homegrown to Levon Helm. Tom warned Levon to keep it cold, but Levon seemed to have forgotten that and thought it would be nice to keep it by the wood stove. And that jug, in fact, did explode and made quite a mess. But you've got some cider stories, and I would hope you would also tell the one about the horse that found its way home when its driver had a bit too
Yeah,
much.
That was my story.
Yeah.
Pa told me. So when he lived up on Silver Hollow, they didn't have vehicles. Everything was done with horses.
Or
Walked. I think it was Shady. They go down to Shady for square dances at, I think, Burham's store, I think is what he had said. But back then, the good thing was you didn't have to worry about driving under the influence because you were on a horse or with a horse and wagon, and the horse would know their way home. So you just get on the wagon and fall asleep or pass out and wake up at home. But they had a new horse, and he was down at the barn dance, and he was going home, and he fell asleep or whatever, and when he woke up in the morning, the horse had Silver Hollow, if any of you have ever been up in the end, it's quite a climb. And there's one steep hill we always call the Enoch's Hill. And there's a turn on that hill, and you go right straight off. There's a driveway, and there was a barn there. Well, the horse decided that was going to be home for the night. So my grandfather woke up, and he was like, "This is not my barn. Where am I?" It took him a minute to realize that the horse had brought him to the wrong barn.
Kind of related, my wife and I, we travel quite a bit, and we're in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I see this T-shirt in this T-shirt shop, and I said, and actually Lauren Rose has one too. I don't know where he got his, but I said, I have to have it. It's a cowboy on a horse with a dog sitting in his lap with the reins in his teeth, and it says designated driver.
But Pa had cider barrels in that ground
In the
cellar.
root cellar, yeah, he never
Yeah.
kept them cold. They were always in, well, the root cellar, I think.
Was cool.
Yeah, like 34 some degrees.
Yeah, it was always very cool.
Year round.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's where they kept all the canned goods,
That
and
was
he'd
the
have bins of,
barrels.
my grandfather was big on potatoes. You had to have potatoes. He'd have bins of potatoes. But,
Yeah, and apples.
you know.
But he
but-
had
and
his
the
own.
And the cider barrels.
And
And
his-
everybody had their own recipe.
Right.
Yes.
I was gonna-
So, and then they would compare, well, mine's better than yours, but nobody shared what the other one did.
No.
You know, they would, so,
But Pa would get aggravated when my brother would bring his buddies home, and
I bet.
they'd go down in that, and Daddy's had his crew down there in my cellar again after my apple cider.
well, that wasn't
He
as
was
bad as that wasn't as bad as the time that, I don't wanna mention names out of, but another Wilbur, young Georgie Wilbur, was working for my grandfather at the time, and my grandfather also had another guy that lived with my grandparents and worked for him, and his name was Mac Ray. So my grandfather went to Florida for a couple weeks or whatever, because my grandmother hated the cold, whatever. He comes back, and he sees that the two of them are there, they're maintaining the farm while he's away, and he goes, well, boys, he says, what do you say we have a glass of cider? And they looked at one another and said, where are you gonna get cider? they had drank all his cider up while he was away.
You talk about everyone had their own special recipe. A number of old-timers that I spoke to mentioned Dave Mazzetti, who started Sunfrost, and he was presumably known for his cider in the area.
And actually, in the late 1800s, that as not certainly as has gone on, a personal collection in the basement. But Woodstock exported over 1,000 gallons of hard cider to the New York City area every year. It was big business because, to my surprise, you know, Woodstock was filled with apple trees, which have somehow got old and disappeared and didn't get replaced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They talked about Pa, who had the horse that took them home. You have a relative with a horse that knew its way.
Yes. Actually, William Reynolds, who was the manager of the Overlook Mountain House, and when he decided with the 7 children that maybe his wife decided they should have their own place, he was building the Reynolds boarding house, which is on the curve of Meads Mountain Road, and he would collect all the leftover scraps of wood, load it in a wagon, and just send his horse, down the mountain. And the horse would get to his new property on Meads Mountain Road and just stop and wait. But those same horses, the same story, he liked to drink with I'm trying to switch his name up here, but he would go to the Keefe Hollow.
Yeah.
I think
Herb
he would drink, and so he would take off in his wagon and go down into there, and they'd drink, and then when he was ready to go home, they would just pour him into the wagon and say home. And he would make his way along the mountain and down the mountain, and when he got to the boarding house,
Yep.
his whoever the family, they just pull him out and put him to bed.
Yep.
A non-cider horse story about them finding their way.
Yeah.
When my grandfather started logging on his property in Willow, Pete and Ralph Sheldus actually cut the timber for him, and it was cross-cut in an axe. It was pre-chainsaw or what. And they skidded the logs with horses, and they had one horse, and I thought all morning trying to remember the name. It started with an S. It doesn't matter. But this one horse, the guys in the woods would cut a log, hook this horse up to it. The horse would take it to the landing or the skidway or whatever. As long as they had somebody there at the skidway to catch the horse and unhook it, and the horse would go back and forth all day on its own, just skidding logs. That's what it was trained for. But if the guy on the skidway happened to be on a cider break or something, the horse would
Went
keep
to the
right on
barn.
going to the barn, towing the log.
Does anybody have any stories to add to any stuff we've gotten thus far? Okay, we talked about the boarding houses, the Reynolds house and the like. Even before the recent influx of weekend city folk in recent times, there was a summer population that escaped New York City and came up to the mountains to escape the heat and the smell and the noise of the city. One of our active volunteers and former board members, Karen Voss, is part of a community of Norwegian immigrants that settled up on Yeri Hill for 4 summers, and Karen remembers Dave Mazzetti's farm stand that eventually became Sunfrost. She remembers the Iceman and the Milkman who made deliveries up Yeri Hill, and Saturdays were market days with trips to Mauer's store. The Yeri Hill Nordic community began in the late 1920s when an artist-architect named Dragseth purchased the Yeri farm and some surrounding land that included abandoned quarries. And Dragseth connected with other Norwegian immigrants in Brooklyn and began renting summer cottages to them. As a young child in the 1940s, Karen remembers coming up with her parents every summer after the last day of school in Brooklyn and staying until just before the first day of school in the fall. The only exception was a summer when there was a polio epidemic in New York City, and our family came up early to escape the epidemic, and Karen finished the school year in Bearsville. Summers were filled with days at various swimming holes. These included swimming in quarry holes up in Yeri Hill, as well as swimming in the Sawkill at spots like Sully's Bridge, Big Deep, and a swimming hole near Reynolds Lane. The swimming holes are where they met the local kids. The cottages were very basic. They had electricity, but water had to be pumped outside and brought in. There wasn't any indoor plumbing. They also had outhouses since there were no indoor bathrooms. Kids had the whole outdoors to play in all day long. The old quarries were a favorite playground where they built play structures and the old bluestone rocks, with the old bluestone rocks. Moms had unique car horn blasts to call their kids home. Dads worked in the city and came up on the weekends. One very memorable time was August 14th, 1945. That was VJ Day, or the end of World War II in the Pacific. Karen remembers she was at the movies in town that day when the firemen came into the theater and had all the children pile onto the fire trucks as they paraded between Bearsville and Woodstock to celebrate the end of the war.
That's cool.
Do you all and anybody here have your own memories or family stories of childhood summers in and around Woodstock, and games played and adventures had and interactions with
Every one of
summer?
them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Born and bred. Every one of my summers was filled with Woodstock.
Well, what I mean
But
is,
but what I'm
Yeah.
referring to that in the cottage communities, Debbie, you'll have to remember this. A lot of places now that are houses weren't houses; they were little cottages like this for the summer. No insulation, no nothing.
Nothing.
But now they're houses you wouldn't even recognize them. But it was the village, Glasgow Turnpike. Even along here, in fact, everything was like little cottages. They weren't houses. They weren't families. They weren't, it's much
The town
much
dramatically
different.
changed from summer to winter. And, we talked about, having, I had my summer friends of Woodstock kids, but also people would come up and rent a house for the summer. And often it was really traditional. Mom would be here with the kids and Dad would come up on weekends. And I had friends that I had for years that just came up every summer, and we really, really looked forward to it. But it was, my parents kept wanting to send me to camp. And I kept saying, camp? Why do I need to go to camp? I live here. There was just so much, certainly, activity as far as, because our friends lived, like Heidi lived on the farm, and people lived in town. They were the kids who grew up. The Maurer family knew every inch of I think the village, the whole town, a lot of freedom. I would ride my bike to the village. I lived on Glasgow Turnpike. I would ride my bike at age 10 to Stowey's, which is where Clouds is, and I would leave it, and then I would do all my errands. I'd go to the library, I'd go to house, I'd get ice cream, and the bike would just sit there waiting for me to come back, fill up my basket, and ride it back up the hill. And, even going to the rec field, lots of activities in the course of that program's been, I think, there since probably the late 50s. But I would just walk there and sort of, wander in and do my activities and wander home for lunch. It was pretty open and free. My brother would play baseball there. I don't know, Danny, if you played ball there, but there was
Played
like
in
an
the valley.
ongoing baseball game there.
It's the difference between
The-
you living in town and
Yeah.
us in the country,
Yeah.
because Willow was its own community, and
Right.
they played ball down on the flats with
Yeah,
all the
in the
kids in
field.
Willow. And we would ride our
All-
bikes to
all
the Willow
five
store,
boys.
where the Willow store, you could have bought your whole week's groceries there. Roy Van Wagner ran it. He had a butcher
Gas
shop
pumps.
there. He had gas pumps. You
That's
could buy
true. Every
everything
town had
you
their
needed.
little store.
So we would ride our bikes down there, but we never left. We didn't go to town. We stayed home. You did. Haying season was the big thing for us in the summer, was doing the hay. And
Could you bike up your hill?
I always,
I'll tell you a good
we were
story
on
about that.
Ostrander Road, is where I grew up, and I was always determined to get up that hill without stopping. I very rarely made it, and you were crisscrossing. Thank God there wasn't a lot of traffic, because you were crisscrossing the road like this.
You didn't have
Try-
10 speeds or 12
No, it was
speeds.
just a regular old bike. So, yeah, you would either bike up or you'd walk your bike up, one or the other.
And I found out early, because like down in the valley is where I had to go to play ball or whatever. And it would be with Skippy Sheldus, would be young Pete Sheldus, Danny Sonnenberg, my cousins, and that's where we went. So, the bicycle, it's great. You get down there in 30 seconds, but then you had to get back up. So I learned very early, and my grandfather told me this a long time ago. He said, bicycles don't make any sense. He says, all you do is pedal the hell out of your legs to give your ass a ride.
Yes, that's what he always said.
He said,
And why would anybody-
He said, a good walk is better than a poor ride any day.
And why would anybody want to ski? It's like coming down a mountain on a pair of bed slats.
But, you know, even in Woodstock, to go to Kingston was a big deal. I mean, when we went to Kingston, that was like a Friday night. We didn't have a grocery, you know, we didn't have like the biggest supermarkets were in Kingston. So to make your list, and for my mother and I to wait for my father to get home with our one car to go into Kingston was considered a really big deal. And from Willow, you added another.
Yeah,
you
coming
know,
to
And then-
Woodstock
Yeah,
was a
it was
big deal.
right.
And my mother,
Was
she would
always
always park out on the street, send us into House. You could buy everything at House too,
Yes.
material,
Yeah.
jeans, socks
Our
and
school
underwear.
supplies, I think my
everything.
whole life came from
And
House.
she'd send us into House with a list because she wanted to sit in the car and people watch.
Oh,
So we get back in the car and you wouldn't believe what I saw.
and we lived on Ostrander Road, which is the top of Cooper's Hill, and one of our biggest games was, and sometimes it wasn't a game, you kick it in neutral
See
at
how
the
far
top
you
of
can
Cooper's Hill and
coast.
see how far you can coast. Sometimes we could almost get to the bowling alley.
You can't do any of that anymore.
Well, because, yeah, my father, we
much
did that down Glasgow Turnpike, we
And,
loved it.
and that's another story. Myself and my little group of friends, sometimes on a Saturday, we'd catch the Troyways bus on 212 in Willow. We'd come down to the bowling alley. We'd bowl for the day, and one of our mothers would come down and pick us all up at the end of the day. That was a highlight Saturday.
Well,
Where
you-
was the bowling alley?
Where
Where
Edna,
that-
Elner.
It was Elna, what is it now? It's IPA,
Across from the Overlook
EPA,
Church.
whatever it is.
Actually,
Yep.
my family.
That was a bowling
That
alley.
was your
Yeah,
family was
my
involved
family
in
built that.
And
It's what paid-
Deanie's.
And Deanie Elwin and my family,
Deanie
and it's
Elwin.
what paid for my college education.
There you go.
It was there. I really hated bowling.
Yeah, that was a bowling alley.
It's also why you got zoning in Woodstock. People were so upset with that building that they went and passed the zoning law.
Oh,
They
really?
couldn't do that.
But I have to say, there wasn't, I mean, as you got older, there wasn't I mean, it was a big deal in our little town to be able, the bowling. I think almost everybody belonged to like a bowling league and.
Right, Janine? how many nights I spent there bowling with your husband?
Tuesdays and Fridays or
I
Thursdays
know.
or Thursdays.
And that little-
Thursday, the Overlook
Yeah.
Men's League.
And it had a coffee shop with homemade pie. So, I mean, it was sort of a little blend. I
It's
know.
delightful. It's delightful. So, young folks were expected to do a lot of chores, and you know, being a young person, you don't always feel like doing your chores. Brad Leonard tells a story. I told you that his dad was Aaron III, and there was Brad's grandpa, Aaron Jr., was a bit cantankerous, and one day Aaron Jr. was looking to see where his son had disappeared to because there was chores to be done, and his Aunt Beatrice did a lot of his raising. So young Aaron came to Aunt Beatrice and said, "Would you hide me?" And when he saw his dad coming down to the house to look for him, he hid up in the attic. And unfortunately, the spot he chose to hide up in the attic was a soft spot over the ceiling. And as his dad was standing in the kitchen looking for him, his feet broke through and his legs were dangling. His dad just looked up and said to his sister, "Go ahead, harbor the little bastard." And he just trudged off to do his work. Do you guys have any stories of shirking responsibilities?
Well, we have to tell what Pa said about. But
About the boys?
Yeah, my father,
With
my father and his buddies, well, it's haying
Started it.
season, come help us hay, so Mackie Carnwright,
Maggie Carnwright, Dayton,
yeah,
Dayton Shelvis.
But anyway, they'd be out in the field and, you know, when you're working, you're working. But when you get a bunch of kids together, what do they start doing? They start messing around and, you know. So my grandfather always said, if you got a boy working, you got a boy. If you got 2 boys working, you got half a boy. If you got 3 boys working, you got nobody.
Because you get goofing around, and one guy, you got one guy on the wagon stacking the hay, and you got the other guys putting it on, and then the guy on the stacking it decides to throw a bale back off at the other guys, and that's how that all starts.
And,
You always had to do chores, but it was always, I mean, I never really
I never thought of
minded
it as a
It
chore.
was just life. It was, we all,
it wasn't a chore. It was
and the whole family, you know, helped out, and especially like with haying and butchering, that was always a big family thing. Everybody came together to do their own parts and to help out.
And where we grew up in Willow, it was like, I was like Tom Sawyer. I mean, the world was out there. You know, I could do any, you know, I'd eat breakfast and I could go wherever as long as I was back for lunch, you know, and my grandfather ended up owning 800 acres. To the west of us, there was another 900-acre patch. To the east of us, there was another 1,000-acre patch that we had total run over. I mean, my grandfather logged on those properties, so we had, so that was, my playground was 3,000 acres, and it was like,
Why go to town?
Right, it was a marvelous way to grow up.
Are you still farming? There's some, and you have some,
My
right?
my sister and I have some animals, not large scale. My sister's got more animals than I. She's got goats and chickens and horses and ponies. I just have cattle right now. A bear did in all my chickens last year, and I haven't rebuilt
You haven't done
that
pigs in a
sense,
few years.
and the pig pen needs attention. So we still do. My sister and I each have our own spot that we built and live on the property. My brother has a cabin on the property. He lives all the way over in Boyceville. But we still do a little bit of farming, yeah. And we still enjoy the property.
we've talked a lot about what I'll call men's work. You want to speak to what your moms and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, what they had to do?
Well, they were always busy too.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, I'm grateful that I had parents that never said you couldn't do anything. So there was no women's work and men's work, although I will say Dad didn't do anything in the house, but it was because he was always busy outside of the house.
I was gonna, yeah.
So Mom did all the housework and the painting and, you know, anything that had to be done around the home, Mom always did. My grandmother, back when they had the dairy farm and that, she had help that came in and helped to feed and take care of the
Because
help,
some of the help lived right with them, and some of the help lived down, but they were
The house I
responsible
grew
for
up in
wheels.
was actually a house that was built for
Right.
help.
Yeah.
They lived there when it was a dairy farm. So we were always busy. They would put up food. Canned meat was still a big thing, even though we had refrigeration. Ma and Pa would always can beef, and there's no better way to make stew than that canned beef that he would put up. But they did, you know, we had gardens,
Yeah.
and they did a lot of that. My mother did a lot of sewing, but my grandmother never. Grandma Ostrander didn't sew. My other grandmother did. Grandma
You filled it
sew
in,
buttons
which
on.
said to grandma.
Yeah. You know, everybody,
Yeah,
they were always busy too. There was always stuff to do.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Deb, you
But-
talked about Elizabeth in the kitchen and
7 children
yeah.
and running a boarding house. And it's sort of interesting because the pictures we have of her husband, he was a very handsome man with white hair and a mustache, and he's always looking happy and like he's having a great time. He loved to talk to the guests. And whenever we see a picture of Elizabeth Reynolds, she's like this. And my father used to talk about his grandmother, and he would say, "Oh, Grandma, she was a mean one." But I think she worked really, really hard. But my great grandmother Allen, who came here in 1908 with her husband, who was a painter, she originally had been a part of a homesteading family who had traveled to Ohio. So she grew up clearing the land with her father, did everything, learned all sorts of skills on this little family plot. Years later, after a very interesting life and traveling and eventually coming to Woodstock, a reversal of fortunes left the Allen family, with not a whole lot to live on. It was her skills that she had learned in sewing, and I think in ingenuity, which made her develop the Woodstock dress, so that she created that dress and sold it as a way of supporting the family. And it was very successful, and it was really based on, as Richard has written about, I never knew till he told me, really, because he does the research, but really based on her early days on their family farm in Ohio. Mm-hmm. She knew how to construct clothing, and it sort of saved the family.
Right.
Well, you remember, my mother was very, everybody can say that. My mother was very special. My mother ran the house. My father was working. My father worked for my grandfather, which wasn't the easiest thing in the world. And they had their own business. So my father would have breakfast, go to work, come home, have dinner, go back to work because they had a logging business at the time, and he was always working on equipment, get things ready for the next day.
And the farming stuff.
Right.
Everything had to be done, the hay.
But my mother used to, talking about sewing and that, her favorite thing was to go to the pattern store. She sewed all my sister's dresses and clothes.
Clothing.
And
She
was a terrific baker. In her later years, she would bake bread, and they would sell it at the Lake Hill Trading Post.
I was just gonna say, she actually sewed some on consignment for people also.
Yep.
She made a lot of stuff.
But she was the disciplinarian.
No, my mother used a machine. In fact, I have her top of the line machine she bought. I remember she was so excited.
About 73 or something.
Yeah, 72 or 73. She got this real fancy Viking sewing machine that she used a lot. And I don't remember her machine prior to that.
That was a regular
But
Singer.
she didn't have a treadle.
Listening to you talk, it's so sad that, how each little hamlet had their own general
Store,
store.
yeah.
Which was so, and it was fun to go to a store, I actually thought going up to Willow was like going to another place. So,
it was.
But too bad, that's a loss, I think.
You
that
had your
those
little stores.
Those little stores, and now as the communities are building up, I think they would be really welcomed again.
But then when you all went to Onteora, because it was centralized,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So how was that, like, you're coming from the farms, which is.
Culture shock.
from
when
both,
It wouldn't have been, if we had all gone to Kingston, that would have really been a culture shock.
And actually, my father went to Kingston
did my
because
father.
you couldn't finish school up here.
Yeah, you had to go to
You had to go to
Kingston.
Kingston if you wanted to continue
Trailways
on and,
bus.
and finish
Beyond
high
8th
school.
grade, I
Yeah.
believe.
So he took a Trailways bus right beyond 8th grade. So he actually graduated from Kingston High School.
But,
My grandfather was actually on the school board when they founded the Onteora District. So he was one of the original school board members.
Yeah.
And Lester Sheldus
And Woodstock School was really, they didn't consolidate into a district until I was like, so you were, but I think I was in elementary school. But there were times my cousins lived in Bearsville and they went to the Onteora School.
Michael did also.
They went up to Boyceville.
For kindergarten through, it was originally
Even though
kindergarten
they lived
through
in West
12.
Ohio Mountain Road, although, and it was when I think I was in probably 5th or 6th grade, that they redrew the lines, and actually so people started coming down from Willow, from the other parts of Woodstock started coming down to Woodstock School. So we had a chance to sort of get to know each other before we all went to Ontiora, and then we met all those Boyceville, Shokan, Mount
Right.
Well,
kids.
yeah, that's where I met your brother.
Yeah,
we, were
well.
we were in kindergarten in Woodstock together.
Yeah. And here you both still are.
Well, why leave a good thing?
You both survived.
Yeah.
We covered a lot of time and territory, and I really appreciate the wonderful stories. Is there anything any of you were hoping to hear about, or occurred to you listening that you'd like to hear something more about, or something we missed, or if there's something that you want to share yourself? Yes, the young lady in the back.
Who you'd like to get to know.
Yes.
I've always been curious, because it features in, family stories in my families. So when you talk about the help, so they came just 1 year, they lived there, you looked down on them, you thought they were equals to you. How did that work? And I know there have been a lot of changes here, like the building of the reservoir brought in a whole other, many different cultures and situations, and maybe didn't really come over to Woodstock as much as Boyceville area, but
Right.
what did your families think about that? Was it?
Well, so you're talking about help like when my grandmother had help,
Yeah,
and
you're saying she
well,
had help, or the help
I-
in the hotel?
I know that my one aunt helped, so I think she came up and helped daily. They had, Matt Gray was a man that lived with them, and he was basically part of the family for years.
And when we were
But-
logging, my grandfather treated the help better than he treated the family. No, really, the packs and everything.
Yeah.
He held mortgages on their
So,
property and everything
but
else.
Matt Gray lived at the farm. He had his own bedroom, and he lived in all of his meals and everything there. And I had asked my dad one time, I said, "What, did Matt Gray have any family? Was he here
son.
because he," and he goes, "Oh yeah, he had family, and when he got real sick,
His son
that's where he ended up going, was back to his family." But he lived up here, and was part of the family for years. And back to the old farm in Silver Hollow, I remember them saying that she wasn't really hired help, but they would swap kids. Like Pa went to work for other families, and you'd live there. And there was a cousin that came to live because the youngest was quite a bit younger. My grandfather's youngest brother, Harvey, was quite a bit younger. So he was the only child going to school and you didn't want a lone child walking through the notch. So they hired or had come in a cousin who lived with them. And when school wasn't in session, she went home. But she was their child, so she was part of the family and helped with the chores, and they boarded her. And in the same sense, I spoke of my father going to Kingston to finish high school. So in the wintertime, he couldn't get the Trailways bus. So he actually lived in town somewhere with Vernon
And-
Wilbur. What was his?
Catherine?
Catherine, Vernon and Catherine Wilbur. So my father actually came and stayed Monday through Friday with someone here in town so that he could get on the bus with their daughter to go to school. So schooling was very important to my grandfather and my grandmother. They wanted my father to continue. They wanted him to go to college too, but that didn't work out. He lasted 2 months.
They walked from Hunter through the notch. Did you mean like to Lanesville, or do you mean to Hunter?
I don't know where
Edgewood.
the actual school was, Edgewood. Do you know
I do.
where?
I do.
You know where the school was?
Schoolhouse was
Yeah.
in Edgewood.
Yeah.
It's not there, but it was just below where the Silver Hollow Road comes out.
Yeah, which is now like
By the
Notch Inn Road.
below Devil's Tombstone.
That's where the,
About it's about 4 lots down from that, headed toward Chichester, and the
Was
Green
the
County
old
line was
schoolhouse.
the schoolhouse on the
Yeah.
right-hand side against the bank.
yeah.
So what do you think,
So-
that's a couple of miles?
I think they said it was a little over 2 miles to a walk one way.
And,
So-
and,
4 miles.
and my,
probably,
and my,
Uphill both ways, yeah.
Right.
yeah.
Potatoes in your pockets.
Yeah.
Do you have any stories about Russell Farm on 375 before it burned down or anything?
Russell Farm on 375.
That's where the dentist's office is now, right? Is that?
Right,
Yeah.
right, where,
That's interesting because
and there's still the little road.
my grandfather's meat house was just down the road from there.
Jones Core.
And he married a Russell. I mean, he married my grandmother.
McDaniel.
No, my
Sure.
grandmother Ostrander maiden name was Russell.
Right.
And I thought she had an uncle that had property on Maverick Road.
There,
Well,
So,
that
but
could-
I don't,
there was the farm, as you went around that bend, there was a house for years, but even and I'm a little older than these two, but the farmhouse, I don't really remember it as any kind of a working farm.
Yeah.
Other than the house was there, and then the house disappeared, and the outbuildings disappeared.
By the 60s, it was abandoned.
And
right?
yeah, it was done, and they tried to make the road a little safer, and things really changed. But my father, would say, around the bend by the farm, what farm? But
the Russell
the
Farm.
Russell farm. But I
And
remember
that's
a
how
really
old-
pretty white house there.
That's how the roads got their names, You turn by the Russell
And
Farm.
how the town looked in your childhood, like Bradley Meadows, I remember.
It was
When I
open.
came here, the drugstore there, but.
There was an A&P there. We had 2 grocery stores in
But
town.
in my little youth, early youth, it was empty. It was still a field. They
Right.
built that probably when I was a teenager.
Like the mural.
Like the mural, but I
Right.
mean, and you can, we've had people here from a generation a little above me who really talked about playing in that, it was wetlands, but also pasture and playing in that field and going back to where you live. How
Playhouse
that would be
Lane,
Playhouse Lane, that was
Clapham
just
Lane.
continuous.
Well,
and
you
they
can
would
see
play
in
and run.
many of the photos in that
How
corner
open.
there.
Transition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was really, and the view
How
was,
wide open it was.
and it really was, you come into town, it was a wonderful way to
But
come in.
One comment that I would like to make, I heard somebody mention something about the open land. Well, a lot of the first people here made the open land.
Right.
That's why all the old stone walls are. Where they created, it was a two-sided equation. They got rid of the rocks out of their field, and they also made a border or a fence to maintain their livestock or whatever. So it was a two-purpose thing.
It's also important, I think nowadays, a lot of people don't understand how important it is to keep open land.
It costs a
And
lot of
how
money to keep
fast
open land.
it takes over. In my childhood, if you go up Cooper's Hill, that was all cleared. Now it's thick brush, and you could see across 212 to Sickler Road when you drove down through by the Lake Hill Firehouse and that. And, we have, so many invasive plants now that make it even harder to keep open space, but it's important to have open
Also,
space.
the tanning industry took a lot of cleared a lot of the.
That was a lot of the clearing because of the timber, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
people say now that these trees are so old, they aren't that old. The ones we got now, they're third generation.
Yeah, it's really hard to actually find, because I was involved looking for old growth in the Catskills, and basically little teeny patches up on the mountains is pretty much all that you can come up with.
Yeah, yeah,
It's not
because
much.
it was logged
It was really
heavily, very heavily.
after the Civil War, when people came back, and so much of the land had been cleared, that farming actually really improved here for a while. Although one of our earliest crops here was wheat, and we did the soil in because quickly, so that then they grew corn.
Changed
and
the pH
it
level.
changed,
and
and eventually we ended up with apples. But
Yeah, corn's not good either over time.
but at some point they did grow corn and wheat and oats and rye and a
Well,
lot of things here.
When
My-
my grandfather ran the dairy, of
Yeah.
course, part of the dairy was corn. And he actually leased property off of the Risley property over in Mount Tremper. So he would plant corn there and then harvest the corn and then take it to Willow and put it in the silo. And because our property in Willow wasn't corn property.
But he had several places where he
Yeah,
leased fields different times, just like with Hayne.
I think he did.
You know, we
I think he
didn't
did-
provide
I
all,
think he did Chase Field for a while too, at one
Yeah.
time.
we didn't, just hay our fields, you know, part of our fields are pasture, so you can't hay them. The ones that we could hay, we did, but we also went down, we hayed the flats, and we hayed, Chases, and we hayed Roy Van Wagnen's, or Ken Van Wagnen's field.
We hayed Lapos and Hutch Hill.
Yeah,
I want to thank my friends Dan and Sue and Deb, and I want to thank all of you for coming out to hear some, I think, really good stories. I want to thank all the folks who gave me some of their time to tell me their stories who couldn't be here in person. And I want to put a plug in. A lot of the stuff we've talked about is covered in this wonderful exhibit, as well as the tool shed. So if you haven't been to the tool shed, please pop in there and enjoy the rest of this day with the beautiful liquid sunshine.
Another quick note.